Those who have experience playing Super Metroid in the long-forgotten past, before there were walkthroughs, before you could find answers on your phone when you didn't know where to go next, when finding a save station was like finding an oasis in the desert, those lucky ones know what it is to be lost in the adventure and the wonder of Super Metroid. The game allowed players to uncover this dark, unknown world seemingly on their own, without dialogue or any help, at times with only the music to keep them company. And when you wander Planet Zebes in this way, you begin to understand that Super Metroid is just a masterclass in what a video game score can do, because it's a soundtrack that doesn't just enhance the experience, but is a crucial element of what makes the game work at all in the first place. In this Behind the Soundtrack, we're going to take a deep dive into how Kenji Yamamoto created one of the most iconic scores in video game history. Metroid has always been Nintendo's eccentric uncle of their gaming franchises. While Mario and Zelda are the name brand cornerstones of the gaming industry, Metroid from its early beginnings has held more of a niche place in Nintendo's arsenal. And I think in a way, that's actually worked in favor of the franchise, because instead of the carefree and cheerful tone of the mainstream Nintendo games, the darker, mysterious tone of Samus's adventures is what lends itself to a more atmospheric sci-fi quality, which has been at the core of Metroid music since its first entry in 1986. Metroid's self-titled adventure was composed by Hip Tanaka, who wanted the game's soundtrack to feel organic and a product of the environment itself. And you can hear this intention all over the game's ambient sound effects and melodies. Following the release of Metroid 2 for the Game Boy, Nintendo began developing a game for their new Super Nintendo. Kenji Yamamoto was brought on to compose the music for the game, and was the first to utilize the improved sound technology of the console for the Metroid universe. What he eventually created set the standard for the Metroid franchise, and is one of the reasons the game has gone on to be recognized by many as one of the great gaming achievements in history. Let's take a look at some of the compositions and break down what Kenji Yamamoto did that was so effective in this game. I think one of the most important factors in how well Super Metroid's soundtrack complements the game itself is that it never tries to do too much. There's a minimalist quality to much of the game's music, which creates a lot of the tension you feel as you uncover the game's environment. The first thing you experience as you drop into Ceres Station is this simple, ambient hum that provides all the tension needed as you discover the scene before you. But then as you wander into this room and see the baby Metroid, there's simply nothing, except for the baby's quiet voice calling out from his container. And then... This incredible use of dynamics and arranging is so next level for a game that was released in 1994. It reminds me of what the role of a movie score is, which actually makes a lot of sense considering Metroid's universe is heavily inspired by a movie franchise. As you fight Ridley and escape, this relentless wave of anxiety and fear is pounding you through your TV speakers, and I want to point out two simple ways the music does this. The first is how the key center is actually moving back and forth between C and E flat. The quick modulations do a couple different things. When you hear music shift up like that, it's a simple way musically to increase the tension. It's like all of a sudden, even though the pace and the melody hasn't changed, you feel like the danger level has increased. And at the same time, it gives off the sensation like you're never in a stable place for more than a few seconds. The second thing I want to point out to a similar effect is the use of the time signature. If you've noticed it's hard to slowly tap your foot to this track, that's because it's in an odd time signature the majority of the time, 5/8 to be specific. And there's something about this meter that sort of adds to the hecticness of the scene at hand, because your ear is used to hearing things in a simple meter, something like 6/8, which the piece also uses during the transitions. The simple idea of that 6th beat being missing every bar during the main section is what makes the whole thing feel frantic and unpredictable. Listen to how this would sound if the main motif did have a 6th beat. Instead, the 5/8 meter combined with the key center moving back and forth is a brilliant example of how Yamamoto took a fairly simple musical idea and utilized just the right amount of creativity with the rhythm and color to create the perfect musical backdrop to this scene. As Samus lands on Zebes, it's the first moment of the game where you're given essentially no context for what you might find. While the tutorial section of Ceres Station had a prior story that you might make predictions on what lay before you, taking your first steps into Crateria is the moment of Super Metroid where you realize there is essentially a blank slate before you. There's no narration, dialogue, or instructions to guide you, and Yamamoto takes full advantage of this by offering one of the most minimal yet perfectly effective tracks in the game. The intermittent long notes from the strings while the thunder rumbles in the distance creates a foreboding sense of ambience that continues for several minutes as you explore the planet for the first time. I think what makes this first section of the game feel so lonely is that by far the loudest thing in the soundscape is actually your own player jumping and shooting. Even from an audio standpoint, there's no evidence of anything else observing you. And yet you absolutely know you're being watched somehow. This whole track is mainly composed from simple groupings of half-step intervals in the low strings and sustained choral tones over top of that. I think this is one of the great examples of how Yamamoto didn't try to do too much in his arranging. I could see easily this section being somewhat ruined by a more in-your-face track, but the way he gives so much space in this first area and lets the tension slowly build is a credit to how Super Metroid is self-aware enough to let the atmosphere take center stage, not the actual music composition. This musical tension is finally broken by the first arrival of the space pirates as you move back through Mother Brain's original lair, and from there, the action begins. Samus continues her adventure through Crateria, but she seemed to have awakened the native life of the planet, and the score reflects the still dark and moody surface of Zebes, but now with the sense that there is hostility around you. As you enter each new room, you expect to be in danger as the music helps create that sensation of a looming enemy. Samus eventually finds her way to this elevator room, and you begin to descend into a new, unknown area. Upper Brinstar has one of the most lively and in-your-face moments of Super Metroid's soundtrack. It's the first time a real consistent percussion track enters into the fold, and I really love how it invokes a sense of wonder and exploration as you journey through the greenery and vegetation. You can almost feel the environment growing around you. This track is a duet of sorts between the lower synths and the choral voices over top. They play off of each other throughout the few different sections of this composition. It's an interesting track because there's a lot happening musically, but there actually isn't much of a noticeable melody that ties it together. There's different motifs that come in and out, such as the accents in the bass from the flat 7 up to the root, and the woodblock-like rhythms that begin the track, but it's simply the combination of all of it that makes up the building blocks of this piece. As much of a foot-tapping jam that the upper section of Brinstar is, its lower companion is quite the opposite. One of the most recognizable Metroid tracks in the franchise, I think this track more than any exemplifies what makes Yamamoto such a brilliant composer. One thing I want to point out with the whole soundtrack that is made quite clear here in Lower Brinstar, you'll notice that in any individual track there aren't many big dramatic changes or big shifts in tone. Instead, each area and corresponding track has a unique identity that remains pretty consistent while you're in it, and it's only when you enter into a new area that you feel those dramatic tonal shifts, like walking from Upper to Lower Brinstar. This is how writing music for a game like Metroid is quite different from simply writing a piece that's meant to be listened to on its own. The music isn't the objective in and of itself, it's just one piece of the whole experience of exploring the game as a player, and because of that, the music is meant to complement the gameplay. So as each track and area has its own character and tone, it's when you put the whole soundtrack together and listen to it as one larger experience, you start to see how each section builds off the previous one. The soundtrack as a whole has a rise and fall to it as you go through it over the course of several hours, days, weeks, or however long you're playing it for. And here in Lower Brinstar, we get one of those big dramatic shifts. You immediately feel the life and growth of the jungle floor evaporate into the lonely, desolate, swampy area of Red Brinstar. The track is very simply built on 2 chords with just a half step separating them. You'll hear this harmonic relationship elsewhere in the game, and it's one of the simple musical ideas that has become pretty heavily associated with the Metroid sound palette. You've definitely heard this idea used in film and other media many times before, the most obvious example being... Unlike John Williams' use of this idea, the slower, melancholy atmosphere of Lower Brinstar's theme creates a much different feeling. Just as it seems the simple idea will continue perpetually, we get one of the most prominent and memorable melodies in Super Metroid. As the undulating strings almost lull you into a trance, the wind instrument over top contrasts with the fast percussion with long, sustained notes and creates that haunting, beautiful tune. It's the sort of tune that gets buried into your subconscious once you've heard it and never quite leaves. There are so many other tracks I could highlight in this remarkable soundtrack. The dark, lonely atmosphere of the underwater Meridia, the slightly overused but epic original lava-filled march of Ridley's Lair, but where the cinematography and storytelling really ascends to an unforgettable level is the last act of the game. With all of the enemies you can think of defeated, including Ridley, who you've assumed to be the main antagonist, you may have found yourself wandering around the planet until you think to check back with this creepy statue that's been accessible since the early stages of the game, but didn't seem to serve much purpose but to visualize the primary alien enemies that once stood in your path on Zebes. But upon entering the room this time, you realize that this room holds a secret. The final stage of Super Metroid. I think this is where the brilliance of Yamamoto and the direction of Yoshio Sakamoto shine the most. As Samus descends into another unknown world, she as well as you the player are completely in the dark of where you might find yourself when you land. And as you take your first steps into the newly discovered Tourian, here is one of the most fascinating examples of how to not do too much as a composer. You're in what you can assume to be the last section of the game, but you have no idea what is about to happen. You find yourself fighting Metroids, which have appeared for the first time since you began playing, and you're slowly making your way through this apparent laboratory. The soundtrack is simply building the tension within you, and there's not much happening besides the bubbling sound effects and the ambient thump of the bass, which you can hardly notice as you're frantically fighting off the life-sucking creatures. Everything from the gameplay to the visuals and the suspense building in the soundtrack is telling you that something is around the proverbial corner. You just don't know what or when. And then we get to one of the few quote-unquote cutscenes in the game as you move through this room and realize that nothing at your disposal can affect these giant side hoppers, and you notice that the soundtrack has changed. And if you've been paying attention, you might notice that this is the track that plays before you enter a boss room, only this time it's continuing through several rooms as you anxiously await what might be lurking down here. And then you're confronted with it. A massive Metroid that quickly disposes of the side hopper that you were harmless against, which is quickly revealing that this is an even greater foe than one that you already couldn't fight against.
This foe is beyond anything.
And try as you may, there's no escaping this Metroid. As you button mash your controller and watch all of your energy tanks that you've spent hours scouring the planet for quickly deplete, you hear a noise that you've not heard since the very beginning of the game. One of the remaining mysteries has been uncovered. The baby Metroid is alive and went through puberty. And from here, for the first time all game, there is complete silence. Only your life alert kindly telling you that you're about to die. As you make your way through this door, you know that the final test is just before you, and you realize the source of everything you've been fighting against this whole time is Mother Brain? Again? But we've already done this. Even if you didn't play the original Metroid, you remember this exact scene from the opening cutscene. Why are we doing this again? And to come to think of it, why isn't the boss music playing? As you launch your collection of missiles into Mother Brain, the game's conclusion is hiding itself in plain sight, because you're feeling a sense of anticlimacticism when she falls to the ground. No epic music? No real resistance, but some fiery Cheerios. And just as you start to feel a tad bit let down, to me, this whole thing is just pure genius. To use your own understanding of the Metroid world against you to deliver the reveal of the nightmare-inducing true final form of Mother Brain. Everything about this is pure sci-fi horror. The slimy drool dripping down her face, the bloodshot eyeball, the hideous roar she lets loose, and the soundtrack to accompany it all is everything you could want. Yamamoto uses a slow ascending chromatic bass pattern to tie the whole battle together. And again, to invoke the feeling of being out of control and over your head, he uses another odd time signature, this one in 7/4. As the relentless bass thumps on over and over, the synths reach a height not yet heard in the game, and give the perfect climactic backdrop to the horror on screen. I would personally love to hear this track arranged and performed by a full orchestra. It would just be mesmerizing to hear this play out with blaring trumpets and strings. The not so much anymore baby Metroid saves you from certain death, but sadly meets its fate in the process. And with the power of friendship and the help of the newly acquired Hyper Beam, you launch an unstoppable fury at the baby killer. I really love how, instead of using the same track as before, the decision was made to change it to this triumphant score, which is accurately titled Theme of Samus Aran, Galactic Warrior. It almost gives the sense of inevitability to Mother Brain's defeat at your hands. Samus sends the monstrosity into oblivion, and if you're familiar with playing a Metroid game, you know what's coming next. The tension reaches an all-time high as you frantically try to find your way to your ship while everything is falling apart around you. The game developers give you one last middle finger as you find yourself at the bottom of this large shaft that you may have tirelessly ascended before, only this time with a ticking countdown just to make things more fun. You may find yourself utilizing the use of some tricks that the cute local animal showed you at some point, which should be all the reminder you need to make sure you save them from the imploding planet, if you're a returning player and know how to do so. And as you gaze upon the familiar side of your ship and jump inside for the last time, it means you've sadly reached the end of your epic journey through Super Metroid. In my experience, I've never quite recaptured the feeling of playing Super Metroid for the first time. To be fair, there's many games I haven't yet played, but inside something tells me that this is a one-of-a-kind type of experience with a one-of-a-kind type of soundtrack. While Kenji Yamamoto and the developers at Nintendo have continued to reach extraordinary heights with the creation of many more amazing games, including more adventures with Samus, Super Metroid has cemented itself as a pillar of story and music composition in the gaming industry. I consider myself incredibly fortunate to discover this game at the time that I did, when I couldn't look up where to go when I got lost, even when the solution was something as obscure as this. And one of the most crucial elements that made the whole thing work was the brilliant, controlled, and masterfully composed soundtrack that to this day is one of the very best that's ever been created.